Hey guys, I'm Mr. Jr. here, aka Mustached Tom, here to review the series X-Men 97. So, as expected, X-Men was in return with the initial inclination that since it was going to be a continuation, that it was going to not be something great. And this seems to be a continuous theme of things that are either remade or continuations. Especially with the large gap of 30 plus years of time between it and its predecessor of the original X-Men in the 1990s. Of course, I grew up watching the X-Men when I was growing up, among many others. Which then inspired me, among other things, to, and this is where my own bias probably comes in, to write my own book based on superheroes called Syndicate X. So the X being a part of the, recent inspiration. So I just wanted to let it be known early on that I clearly have a bias towards the X-Men in my own way. And fair enough, I think a lot of people do too. Now, I made my initial, I think I made an initial, like a sort of early video about how I thought the earlier episode sort of opener was being handled and so on. But the season has come to a finale, so now I can go over the entire season. And with 10 episodes under its belt, I will say that it covered a massive amount of subjects, dealing with various character arcs, all interlocking, and with that does come with a bit of sacrifice for certain characters over others, because of the limited space there is within 10 episodes to dedicated to having each X-Men have a moment. And I think the actual best example is Sunspot, if anything, the newest addition to the X-Men in terms of this iteration. He was the young kid who joined up, kind of got an early crush on Jubilee, and then it sort of skips his training / him getting the suit, and then sort of just implies that he kind of just got both of those things off screen somehow. So that's a very clear example of, that being short-packed with the amount of material being handled here. When you have stuff going on with Storm losing her powers and then getting them back, with Forge, you have the whole thing with Jean Grey and her clone. And out of the main characters, I would probably argue that in terms of like a dark thing happening to them, I'd probably say Beast was probably the least affected by all of it. Though I suppose he got affected too in his own right with the reporter woman that I don't know if he had a crush on her or what, but because it seems to be a little bit of back and forth between what his whole deal is with her and how that became a part of her among a bunch of other humans becoming part Sentinel in their end sort of saga. And I will say that I was watching some other reviews, mainly criticizing Rogue and Gambit more so, and their treatment within this series, how they were character assassinated and so on and so forth. Now, I'm going to try my best to steelman the show, trying my best to see what the show is offering and say whether or not, it's all good and all that. Well, the thing is, I wasn't a fan of the whole Rogue X Magneto thing either myself, But I was at least willing to see where they were going to go with it, and there did seem to be implications that they had some sort of intimate relationship at some point. And I digress, but in saying so, there was this higher form of criticism in terms of Rogue's direction in continuing to follow Magneto after the fact of him, quote unquote, dying and then finding out he was alive. And Magneto offering up his perspective about how humans versus, mutants would be, the claim to fame that has been sort of this whole linchpin of this season was Magneto was right. The slogan that has been sort of thrown around here and there throughout the show. In the context of the show, it has been criticized. However, I would probably argue that this is the best part of the X-Men. It makes Magneto as a character so fascinating that they linchpin him under still being someone who was a part of the Holocaust. Right, they keep that backstory from the thing that was added on to his character. And he keeps this mentality of the only way to fight back is, to fight violence with violence. He is that personified, fighting violence with violence. And I think a lot of people in real life kind of actually sway a lot closer to that side more often than not. So the whole catchy slogan has a bit of weight to it, in my opinion. And it is reinforced in the show as well, with characters seeing the damage of Genosha, for example. And, Rogue said, in fact, that she was there, witnessing this Uber Sentinel just take out a bunch of mutants. And that might have blindsided that Magneto wasn't properly, he EMP'd the Earth, which is, a potential way for the Earth, or the world as we know it, to end. However, I would also argue, in defense of the show, that leaving that Uber mech, that Uber Sentinel, and leaving the other Sentinels alive would also cause another apocalypse. One in which it's an arms race to see who has the Sentinels, who can use them as weapons. This is something that is very common, especially within, the preview of America, especially. And the fact that that would be so weaponized is the opposition to, just turn off all electricity. And yes, Magneto did cause damage. He is a good antagonist for that reason. He is not pure of heart by any means. In fact, I would argue this is what makes him one of the better villains that I have seen in such a long, long time outside of this whole relationship with Rogue. I'm not a fan of that either myself. I just kind of thought whatever on that. But in terms of the context of the show, it really provides a vassal for something that, when you look at it from a real life perspective, it really does reinforce this idea that, I think a lot of more people are guilty of and don't even know that they are guilty of it. Again, fighting violence with violence. And I did, Sunspot's character development here is a bit rushed, but we do get something with him, and that being that, he's the new mutant of the group. He comes out to his mom as a mutant, and then, that puts her political sway because she's, this political figure in the world. and that puts her own political risk at bay, and when Sunspot is in danger of being arrested by the Sentinels, she says, go with them, and that's why, from his perspective, and even more probably justified than even Rogue, that he probably wouldn't know the ramifications of what Magneto just did. Even though Wolverine himself explains as such, saying that he has called forth a war. A war that, from Magneto's perspective, is completely justified. And again, that justification is what makes him such an interesting villain. Is that he was even willing to also, put up with Charles's perspective for quite a time at the beginning of the show. And seeing how that was still failing in some of its own regards. And how people are still so quick to be like mutants at birth. We're not gonna have mutants be born in this hospital. That happens in the show. People in the government being like, we can't favor, these people, which we also see in the show. These things are reinforced time and, in these little bits throughout the show. And it kind of cultivates that another mutant, one that can control the Sentinels themselves, is gotten to too late. And again, it kind of recalibrates Magneto's own thing of violence propagating violence, and how that outcome is still not favorable through his perspective, that he was gotten to too late through, Charles trying to get to him, and how that led him down this different path. Having that one key figure in your life, in real life, having that one person to be like, you don't have to hate this entire group of people, you can choose another way. Someone to stray you away from this destructive path. These things that can feel so easy to do in real life and fall victim to in real life. Definitely coming across through all sorts of, interpretations. And, there have been a lot of videos about how X-Men has gone woke, and I put that in quotes because the word woke to me has just become a replacement word for diversity at this point. I don't see any distinction between the two words as far as I'm aware, and conservatives, as far as I know, use that word to lambast any show with woke themes. And, I'm trying to figure out what is the distinction, what makes something diverse and good, but what makes something quote-unquote woke and bad. What is that distinction, if those two things are even different things? Because I don't know if they are anymore. And to me, X-Men really exploited that for me, among other shows. Whether or not they get covered at all, or if they get covered in such a way that, they say it's woke because, or it's bad because it's woke. To me, that signifies that this reviewer is not worth trusting, or is a bad reviewer. Things like that really signify to me, when I'm watching videos and not making them, that this reviewer isn't worth trusting, because they're completely, the whole thing about being as objective as possible is not even put into question anymore. And it really lambasts other stuff on top of that. And with that, I will also add on that, there is this one episode where it's more of a laid-back episode with Jubilee. Then there's like tons of video game references and stuff like that. Like, yeah, they had 10 episodes, and there definitely, again, there are those smaller gaps of things I wish I would have seen, and I think that if given the additional episodes, I think X-Men 97 is easily a 10 out of 10. Like, this is peak superheroes. This is, to me, better than Invincible. Yeah, Invincible. Like, straight up. Like, that new superhero, you know, superhero series where, in retrospect, I went back and thought about it and thought about, like, how, you know, the first end of that episode, the first episode is like a shock value for almost shock value's sake, and how they almost really lay on thick on that, and how way more characters' pacing is sacrificed in order to move certain other characters along. And, you know, it does plague this show, but to me it only really seemed to affect, again, Sunspot as far as characters who had moments. And, you know, again, things happening off screen or just mentioned, you know, just said as like, oh, this is a thing now. You know. So things like that I think also could have been touched up, of course. I'm not saying X-Men by any means is perfect. By no means, but I think that this is still a fantastic show, really close to being that 10 out of 10. So much that I would argue that I would probably push between an 8 or a 9 out of 10 in terms of quality writing here. And really cementing character, you know, moments where we have, you know, your monologues that are very impactful for characters and character relationships, like between Storm and Jean, whether that be between what happens with Gambit and his sacrifice and what that meant and what that can still mean. You know, I would still argue that death alone outside of Genosha is probably better than anything handled in Invincible, as just another example. Because to me, again, that first episode, just thinking about it, you know, it still comes across very close to shock value for shock value's sake, instead of, you know, something that is reinforced by the narrative of what's going on, which is what is very much present in X-Men 97. The prejudice has already been established. It has been since the original version of the show. You know, mutants are the freaks, they're the outcasts, they're the ones with the abilities, you know, it's unfair that they have this advantage, or whatever you would want to call it. Or, you know, disadvantage, depending on what, you know, what it is that they can do. And how that separates them. And now when you have a Sentinel that is sent from the future, or whatever it was, it reinforces this idea that, well, mutants are just, you know, a part of the, you know, just, you could just wipe them out and it wouldn't be a big deal. In fact, it might even be a boon, as it were, for the humans anyway, from their perspective, at least the ones that are against mutants existing. So that is early set up from the original show and is carried over here, which allows it the opportunity to have these more impactful moments, such as Gambit sacrificing himself, to mean a lot more. And I actually like the fact that they did not bring Gambit back. And I know that I saw one other reviewer saying how, you know, he's constantly worried how they weren't going to bring Gambit back and how that would be a bad thing that if they weren't going to. However, I think that that's a really strong thing that they didn't do it yet, if they are going to plan to do it. And to me, it holds the weight of season one. It holds the weight. It doesn't sacrifice it. It doesn't, put it away and reset it. It says, no, this happened. At least, in terms of season one. So I think that's really strong writing. I would, again, equate this to the willingness to go for it. In the comparison I would like to make, and it's a strange one because same writers as Invincible is The Walking Dead. And, they were willing to, have one of the most, they were willing to sacrifice the viewers, and they sunk it. They hit it, because it was one for one what was happening in the comic of The Walking Dead. And of course I'm talking about, spoiler alert for The Walking Dead show, even though it's been out for a while now, Glenn's death. That, to me, is the linchpin. That, to me, signified that The Walking Dead was ready to come back and be something more than what people were expecting. Despite the initial rage, despite losing fans, that came more so from an emotional moment. Not that the writing was bad, but from an emotional moment. People were so invested in these characters that they would rather say, I won't watch this if X character dies. That was The Walking Dead at its peak. And the way that it was able to eliminate these characters in such a brutal way and stick to it as, close to the comic as you can conceivably get, and actually just do it, that takes guts. That's a risk. And it's a risk that hurt The Walking Dead despite how good it was. Like, how excellently crafted that whole episode was leading up to everything that was that scene. And yet, it was the sacrifice that they were willing to do. That, to me, shows that The Walking Dead used to have a lot of guts. And same here goes for the X-Men 97. The fact that they didn't bring Gambit back, at least for season 1, tells me that these writers have guts. It shows me that they're willing to be like, hey, sometimes we gotta let things sit, let things stew, let these emotions, beget us. Let these, they are willing to take that hit if anyone was a fan of Gambit, which I'm pretty sure, outside of the reviewer that I saw, there are probably other many Gambit fans. Very likely. I mean, Gambit wasn't my personal favorite, but he was among them. He was among them for me, myself. I'm personally more of a Nightcrawler fan, so when he jumped on board the X-Men after Gambit was gone, I was like, okay, well, I mean, it feels a little cold to say, but I do enjoy Nightcrawler's presence in the X-Men a little bit more than Gambit's, just a little bit more. So yeah, it definitely stuck the landing in that regard, and that, that emotional oomph that this show definitely puts forward, and it definitely holds the narrative, if it didn't have before, that it could easily, even though it might have not been the original intention, death of the author is very much a thing, that, this could be an allegory. It can still be an allegory for, the oppressed, for the LGBT community. That's very much in line with a lot of the show's writing still. And even was for a long time, even if that wasn't the original intent. Whatever people take away with the thing is still more important than what was originally written. Always remember this. Despite what Stan Lee might have said, or, did upon his creation of said X-Men, it's very much still among the viewers to pull that information from what's being what the end result is. That is what's crucial. That is what's important. And to me, it definitely reads as such. It definitely reads as an allegory for an oppressed group of individuals who are trying their best to just get through and, go beyond and above the call of duty to be seen as quote unquote normal, to be accepted into society as part of, human, civilization. That allegory to me is so close to being, again, gay, bi, lesbian, transgender, or transsexual, either one. Any of these categories or groups. And, how that used to be way more prevalent, well, in the era of the 97, which is, again, why I think the title of the series is so prominent. Because remember, gay marriage wasn't even a thing until 2000 something. I forget which year. I remember it was the Obama administration set of years. So it was around that era when gay marriage became equal to, and it still gets put under threat to this very day. And then you just kick the can, and then it becomes about trans people and how, they're the ones who are getting pushed and pulled in the political sphere, and they get, the transphobic treatment by conservatives because of course they do, because it was the same thing for the gays. And, before then it was women who couldn't even vote, and before then it was blacks being segregated from whites. There's always an outgroup. There's always a set of outcasts. This has been America's history. There's always been a group of outcasts. And I think X-Men covers a lot of that stuff. And it could be any number of those things. And the added bonus of them just having the powers is just like, well, that adds on to the superhero spectacle of it all. And to me, when I was writing, Syndicate X, I very much wanted to create my own group of superheroes based off, a lot of what I was seeing in the X-Men among other superhero stuff. And I kind of wanted to create my own world that was separated from Earth and, see what that would look like if things were rearranged, if the time was very much different, if, we had actually advanced a lot more, but still had this sort of outlook on certain groups of people. Because that still seems to ring very much, again, true to this very day. And this was something I was writing since I was a kid, and it sort of transitioned to when I was in high school, of course. Probably the most when I was in high school, because I was exposed to a lot more information about, what possibilities there were, especially in the type of high school I went to, which is the best high school, I would argue, in the United States of America. Because it's the only one I'm aware of that allows individuals to follow their individual passions. So, there's that. And, that allotted me a lot more time to work on these narratives and to create these characters that, I once used to directly just rip from direct stories, but I would have these characters that I would just throw in, interacting, whether it was like how I would interact with these characters, and then slightly personify myself in a slight way, and then create a variation of myself in terms of storytelling, and then how that would pull into another character, and then another character, and then more characters sort of derived from that initial pinpoint of like, well, what if I were in, this story that already exists? Oh, what if I knew someone who was like this? and then sort of reworking my way from there. And there were a few other edits in college that I was making when I was still in college. And X-Men definitely was something that was still in my mind at the time, but I was, you know, there were definitely a lot of rewrites that I was working with, but by the time I published it, there were still plenty of flaws in my own book. And, I think that is worth criticizing on my end, despite outcomes what may, but anyway, I am getting sidetracked with Syndicate X stuff. In terms of X-Men 97, again, I would probably stick it with either a 9 or an 8 or a 9. I probably would lean towards an 8. Again, I think that the small gaps in storytelling is definitely what puts it there, or a 9 at very most. And if given like 1 or 2 episodes within season 1, I think those were the little things. Like if they were just added in, I think that this, again, would have easily been a 10 out of 10 show. And that is my review of X-Men 97, and if you ended up enjoying it, then please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. Also make sure to check out those links in the description. One will head over to my petition to help out smaller YouTubers, second to my PayPal where you can help support me and my channel directly, and third to my Discord server where you can join, collab, chill, do all that cool stuff, and until next time everyone, bye bye.